Roe Duke Watson, maybe you could tell me what you remember about why Dennis Noonan made a good candidate for working on the Columbia Icefields expedition.
I wish I could answer that in detail because in interviewing these 60 that we chose somehow, just having to judge their qualifications, I don't remember at the time who Dennis Noonan would have been. It was just, I got to know him later on during our experience, but I couldn't begin to tell you why his qualifications seemed any better than anyone else's. It might have been because he was able to talk a good line.
What do you remember about him?
I remember him being very affable. He had a good sense of humor, and I remember him being a hard worker. And I can't say that I really saw anything of Dennis once our expedition broke up and we were all returned to different units, and I doubt if I ever saw Dennis again.
Is there anything else that you want to cover regarding
I may have to take that back. We'll find out from Marilyn, my wife, whether we ever met Dennis later in civilian life when he came out here with his wife. I think perhaps we did, but we'll verify that.
Can you think of anything else that you would like to add regarding the Columbia Icefield expedition?
Well, there are a lot of memories of it. The units had a field day up there once we got that camp built and got the Studebaker Corporation accommodated for, and things began to flow smoothly. There was a fair amount of spare time, and so I would allow the personnel from the advanced unit up there to take off climbing. I wouldn't let too many go at once, but would let, out of roughly 30 men we had there, maybe a half dozen or so go at any one given time. And we were ringed by some of the highest mountains in the Canadian Rockies. So they, one by one, knocked off practically every one of them. They did not climb Mount Alberta, which was a very severe climb, and it was a little too far away, or Mount Saskatchewan, but they, Mount Columbia, which is the highest point in the main range of the Rockies. Mount Robson is higher, but Columbia is next to Robson, and they climbed Mount Columbia and the Twins, so-called, and Mount Athabasca and Mount Andromeda and several others. So they just, this was extremely rewarding to the personnel that were up there. I had one brief junket over to Mount Andromeda, which was a spur, a satellite of Mount Athabasca, because I just couldn't, I had too much responsibility and I couldn't afford to be away from camp too long. But that was a real highlight for a lot of the group.
When you returned to Hale, what was the next highlight for you?
Well, we didn't return to Hale because Hale was still being built. We returned to Fort Lewis. And by then, however, by the time we got to Fort Lewis, which was just before Christmas, the 86th, which was a newly constituted regiment, all of which had been built up since I left for the Columbia Icefield, and they had been moved out and sent over to Camp Hale. They were getting broken in at Camp Hale, Colorado, and here the 87th, the original regiment, was still at Fort Lewis. But within a few days of our arrival back, the whole regiment was entrained down to Hunter Liggett military reservation in California, which was very close by the Hearst Ranch. Wonderful country for maneuvering in, and this was just a time killer. until barracks were ready for us at Camp Hale. So we spent over the Christmas holiday, we were there, and somewhere along in about the second week of January, I guess, we entrained for Camp Hale. Yeah.
When you think about Camp Hale, what are some of your best memories of Camp Hale?
Well, the very first memories were, as we arrived there, we heard of this pristine place high in the the Colorado Rockies, and lo and behold, upon arrival by train, we disembarked from the train, and here was this pall of haze and smoke all over the valley, and it was more of a big basin than a valley. Now, Camp Hale was at, I hesitate to say now what the altitude was, or is. It's something on the order of 9,000 feet, I believe. Tennessee Pass, which is just a few miles south and uphill, is maybe somewhere between 11 and 12. I'm guessing a little bit at this. Probably around 11. And Leadville, just shortly under the pass, was definitely over 10, I believe. And it was an old mining town with an opera house and so on. But when we arrived, because we were on the main line of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway, and as all the railways all over the continent were, they were working overtime, just constant trains, hauling gear, personnel, and so on. And the Denver Rio Grande was no exception. But whether they were headed east or west, they were chugging up these long grades, gaining a lot of elevation, and they'd have to put on helper engines. Now, these were all steam engines, burning coal and spewing cinders and coal smoke like you couldn't believe. And as they would arrive at Pando, which was the station for Camp Hale, Pando didn't exist other than what was now Camp Hale. There was this pall of smoke that just sat there most of the time. And as soon as we moved into our barracks, we noticed all this personnel that was already there were talking with croupy voices or coughing. And they said, "We all have the Pando croup. You'll get it. It's very popular here." So sure enough, within a week, we all began to acquire it. The pollution was just something that would dismay an environmentalist today. It was so bad.
Were you happy to go on maneuvers out of camp because the air would be clean?
Yep, that was one big feature that we did love getting out of camp for that very reason.
Were you happened to be on any of those training expeditions between Aspen and Leadville, or Aspen and Camp Hale?
Yes, I had one wonderful trip. That would have been the summer of 1943 in the 10th Reconnaissance Troop, and John Woodward, Captain Woodward, and I took, I think it wasn't our whole troop. It was the recon troop was probably close to 200 men. There was either one or two platoons that we took on about a 10-day expedition. It was a wonderful trip from Camp Hale to Aspen, going on a rather spectacular route past the Mount of the Holy Cross, which was quite a magnificent peak not far from Camp Hale, and thence through a meandering series of mountain range, all part of the Sawatch Range, and then finally down the Roaring Fork River into the main valley, just short of Aspen. It was a wonderful trip that was in beautiful weather, and we weren't really trying to prove much. It was sort of a time killer, but we weren't traveling in a combat mode. We weren't carrying rifles or ammunition and so on. We were carrying our overnight packs with food. By then we had these good mountain rations. But it was just like a delightful hiking and camping trip in the mountains, which we thoroughly enjoyed. We would do a few exercises like ascending a nearby snow slope and practicing glissading coming down, or there were 2 or 3 insignificant high points that we would scramble up just as a break in the routine. But it was a thoroughly delightful trip.
Do you recall any particular challenges to it?
Well, everybody had such a good time. I don't think they regarded it as a challenge. We had some wonderful personnel on the trip. I remember one of the people who was I particularly remember doing one of the climbs with was Friedel Pfeiffer, who came from quite a skiing background and made quite a name for himself, as I'm sure you, Abbie, are aware, in both Aspen and Sun Valley later on. One highlight at Camp Hale was the climbing cliffs where various battalions would rotate practicing on these C Street cliffs, we call them, because the streets were lettered at Camp Hale, A, B, C, and so on. And these climbing cliffs bordered C Street. And when it was our battalion's turn to practice some rope climbing and rappelling descents and so on, we'd move out for the morning for the C Street cliffs. And normally we'd, on the way over and back, we would pass the main mule corrals for the division. Now the division's table of organization called for 5,900 and some odd. It was almost 6,000 mules. And there they were, a lot of the time just enjoying the good life in their corrals, not being put to use. But we would march past those corrals every morning while we were in training at the cliffs. And then at noontime on the way back to the barracks, we'd pass them again, and the mules were used to it and didn't pay any attention at all. One day it was announced that it would be Chemical Warfare Alertness Day, and we all had to travel with gas masks and do whatever activity we're doing wearing gas masks. And some of the chemical warfare squad would come around in jeeps and pellet us with tear gas and so on, just to make sure everybody was using their gas mask and knowing how to use it. Well, on the way back, I don't remember on the way over, I don't think maybe we had donned our gas masks then, but on the way back, we marched past the mule corrals in our gas mask, and along those fence lines, the mules were absolutely crowded, shoulder to shoulder, looking at these strange figures going past with gas masks on. And I remember marching at the side of my column, looking back, and here were all these mule heads just following us. They're intelligent animals, but they just recognized something was wrong about these individuals marching past them. That's an outstanding memory. There were some good trips out of Camp Hale. Of course, the maneuvers up, which you are well acquainted with, up on Homestake Peak and that territory were spectacular. less spectacular, but very pleasant, were several sort of testing trips, which were not so much attempting any military maneuvers, but learning to travel through the mountains in somewhat of a military mode, where we'd be not presenting too much of a target. We'd be spread out in various formations, but still traveling as a unit. And we'd go by companies. So I remember twice taking my company on what would be a week-long trip from Camp Hale over to a destination, a beautiful meadow, where we would terminate and come back. But that beautiful meadow was in a sheep pasture that is today Vail, Colorado, the Vail ski resort. And it's just coming to Vail today and trying to picture that old pasture is impossible. You can't relate the two, but that was a great trip. And I remember I did twice. Once was in midwinter, and another one was in springtime on corn snow. Both times it was interesting in our method of travel. The 3 rifle platoons of an infantry company were equipped with skis, and then our weapons company, our weapons platoon rather, each infantry company had a weapons platoon, and our weapons platoon would travel on snowshoes because their packs were enough heavier that the skis were really difficult. And the interesting thing was that as we'd leave Camp Hale, we'd go up a long, gently ascending valley, all in pretty good formation and all traveling about together. And then we'd arrive at the base of a good stiff pull where we're having to go across a ridge. The skiers, the 3 platoons, rifle platoons, all throw off their packs, dig out their skins, and then have to take off their skis, put the skins on. Now it's one thing for 3 or 4 men to do that and do it fairly promptly, but for 3 rifle platoons, probably close to 150 men, to do it in punctual time is not quite so easy. So we would spend quite a bit of time. There'd always be some stragglers. Meanwhile, our weapons platoon would just amble on their snowshoes, and as we chugged up the grade to surmount the ridge, they'd be standing with their hands in their pockets, sort of waiting for us. Then we'd get to the top, and they were under orders to wait at the ridge, I guess, most of. And at the top, we'd wave bye-bye and go. We'd take our skins off. They'd start down, but no, I don't think they would. I think they wanted to stay out of our way. We had to wait until we skied forward, and then we'd leave them way behind. But at the end of the day, almost invariably, those snowshoers would be at our camp destination first. It was not easy for skiers to swallow, but the fact remained that over a given period of time, they could outdistance us.
What was your major recollection of D series?
Well, I'll have to confess that I was at Seneca Rocks, West Virginia, during the entire D series. I had mixed feelings. I would love to have been there to participate, but in some ways I was thankful I wasn't from what I heard about it. We had an earlier maneuver which couldn't compare with D series, but it was still a rigorous one, and that was our first winter over there, which would have been early '43, probably in late January, maybe February. I forget whether it was full regiment or not. Yes, I think it was. The whole 80s, I think it was the whole 87th, maneuvered up around Homestake Peak. And We had our marching orders or our skiing orders, and we had to pack full field equipment. And I remember now I was just a platoon leader in G Company of the 86th. So I said 87th, I'm wrong, it was 86th. And each company was kind of put on its own, headed for our destination on assembly ground, fairly near the summit of Homestake, but a big sort of a plateau-like area. And people began to drop out that just couldn't cope with that much elevation gain. Not many, but there were a few dropouts, and there were stragglers. But my platoon kept up pretty dang well, and we were persistent. And I remember being quite proud that my platoon were the first unit to get to this destination point. And the others all began to come in later in our company, and the rest of the battalion for that matter. So we all felt pretty good about that. But we camped out up there for several days, and there wasn't really much in the way of a simulated warfare the way there was in the D series. This was more learning to live under tough conditions. It was sub-zero weather, and we had these new tents, which the Quartermaster Corps designed. They were a real curse. That was one of the worst items of equipment because they were absolutely impervious to moisture. No moisture could get in, no moisture could get out. So we'd wake up in the morning and sit up, and immediately about 2 inches of frost from the roof would go down your neck. Yeah, those tents were really bad. And there were thousands of them sold later after the war to the general public, but they were real losers. They were tough tents, but they just, the Quartermaster Corps had really not thought that one through because it just captivated all that moisture from our breath. But that's where we first engaged also on that particular maneuver with these mountain rations, and we just fell in love with those. They were so much better than C rations or K rations, and we really enjoyed them. There was good variety.
What was in them?
As I remember, there were about 4 distinct menus, but there were a lot of choices. For instance, they were packaged in a very sturdy carton, waxed cardboard, I guess, that was moisture resistant, and but easy to open. And each of these packages was 1 day's ration for 4 men. So you team up in groups of 4, and each one had, surprisingly, I think 4 different types of drinks, all in dry form. There was cocoa, milk, tea, and coffee. You know, they were all there in various forms, little packages or tea bags or whatever. Now I can't remember what the entrees were, but they were certainly better than the general C ration or K ration, which were the 2 common rations that most of the Army was familiar with. And the variety was pretty good. Of course, we were given these there would have been no more time we would have been any hungrier, so they tasted delicious to us. There was another aspect of that early maneuver that was interesting. With those tents causing the problem they did, there was a lot of ingenuity, and we had time to utilize, and so snow caves began to be built, and we had lots of snow. The snow was deep, and the structure was such that we could build good snow caves. And in our cooking equipment, we had these little kettles that we used to dig snow out, and with surprising haste, we began to build we'd build a tunnel, and then expand it into living space. And we got some fairly elaborate snow caves. And then we'd, today, environmentally speaking, this would be a sin, but we'd whack off alpine fir branches and have a thick mat of those all over the floor, and then we'd build little shelves. And we were living in quite good comfort in those snow caves. There was one problem. You had to be very careful in scalloping the roof carefully, because if you left little points from the baling you would be doing, they'd form stalactites, and then they'd drip all night. Because with 4 men in there, it might be sub-zero outside, but the snow caves would warm up, and they'd be above 32 degrees, and you'd get a little drip. So we had to learn to carefully scallop off so there were no points. But the other bad part was there was a certain amount of maneuvering, and might be an occasion when our company, our battalion, were all at rest, some in their tents, but a lot of us in these snow caves, and some other battalion would come perhaps before dawn on some sort of a nighttime maneuver, skiing right over this could even happen in the early morning hours when we hadn't arisen, and there were several occasions, never happened to me, but where a squad or so of skiers would cross one of these snow caves that hadn't been dug deeply enough, and the whole roof would cave in. And there was chaos, of course.
Now, can you think of anything else regarding training before we move on to battle in Italy?
Regarding training, well, serious training, of course, gradually built up. What I remember mainly there was so much of our training all through the Camp Hale experience, as well as at Mount Rainier had been, was learning to exist as organized units and travel under rigorous mountain or cold weather conditions. When we were down at Camp Swift in the final months before we went overseas, I arrived there from West Virginia, along with the rest of the group that had been there with me. Shortly before we started what was called POM, Preparation for Overseas Movement, and that was deadly serious training in all kinds of combat conditions. And the Army had gradually constructed this POM based on earlier experience and some combat experience that was taking place in Europe. So we were actually going through, and with all the troops were going through, not just simulated fire, but live ammunition fire. We'd have to learn to crawl along, snake through a barbed wire that had been erected, supposedly a minefield out there. Of course, there were no actual mines, but there were simulated mines. But having to definitely keep at a certain level of crawling or creeping, with live ammunition buzzing overhead, mortar rounds exploding off to the side, and that was quite an experience. Gave a hint of what was to come, but only a hint.
That must have been nerve-wracking.
Well, in a way it was nerve-wracking, because once we got into combat, that was a whole different affair. I think there was always in combat, I'm getting ahead of myself, maybe I should save those remarks. This was nerve-wracking because we didn't have the distractions of combat to be occupied with. And yes, we were, it was foretelling a taste of what was to come. So I think it was very impressive and somewhat nerve-wracking to most people. And then We had all sorts of rigorous tests to do as battalion, company, and platoon. And that was a very busy time. It went on for about 6 weeks, just before we moved out for Italy.
Let's move on to your battle experiences in Italy. How about if you set the stage for me and describe for me the your first action that you were the most involved with?
The first action I was most involved with? Okay. Being part of the 86th Mountain Infantry, we were, I don't know whether it was drawn by lots or not, but the 86th was moved out on a separate flotilla of ships that went as a unit. There were no troop transports that just went as individual transports. They all went in a group that were accompanied by destroyers and all sorts of protective Navy vessels. And our unit was moved out from Hampton Roads, Virginia, long before the rest of the division even left Camp Swift. And we weren't sure we were ever going to see the rest of them again. But in any event, we landed in Naples. And what am I leading up to here?
Your first battle experience?
Oh, yeah. Well, there were minor incidents. We were in Naples only something on the order of 72 hours, I think. And then our battalion, not the whole regiment, but our battalion was put on an old Italian freighter. And we spent all one day and part of a night heading up to Livorno, or Leghorn, as it's better known in English. And that was our next staging area, getting closer to the combat zone. And
well, what do you remember about your first battle experience?
Well, this is coming at Leghorn, hardly a battle experience, but the first one that caused casualties. We, unknowns to us, as we encamped, and this is very near the Tower of Pisa, we, in a big field, there was a lot of strolling around. We weren't in any particular maneuver, but there was I happened to be in the vicinity, and there was an explosion, and somebody had triggered a mine and blown his leg off. And a chaplain rushed forward to be of support and triggered another mine, and it killed him instantly. So that was a real message to the troops, what those minefields could do. There couldn't have been a better bit of instruction than that. It really impressed all of us. But going on from there, we were shortly thereafter sent to the actual front, and our regiment was put into a temporary unit called Task Force 45, and we had all sorts of elements in this task force. My particular company was on the far out, and we replaced them in this little town of Bani DeLuca. Bani DeLuca. Mm-hmm. My Italian's not very good. The British officers were quite jolly in their outlook. They were seasoned in combat. This particular group had been through North Africa, Sicily, and all the way up the boot, so they'd had plenty of combat experience. I asked them about some of their battle down at Monica.
Where the Abbey is? Where the big Abbey is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Montecasini, yeah. And they said, oh yeah, we were bashed about a bit in that typical British understatement. But then they had another remark about the poor 92nd. Said, when the 9-2 div gets the order to advance, they all lean forward in their foxholes. I don't know that this needs to be repeated or not, but that was the feeling. And it was understandable. Their morale was so low, and it was too bad. But they certainly have proven themselves otherwise.
You're about to tell us about your first battle experience.
Well, other than those patrols, which didn't cause any making contact, they were interesting because the patrol from the 92nd Division would not be traveling in defilade at all. They'd come along on the skyline, and our patrol would be amazed because they were within complete visibility to the German troops, a short distance to the north, and they seemed to disregard that. But anyway, they'd make contact with us every day, and then the two patrols would decide where and when to meet 24 hours hence, or within the 24-hour limit. Then came, this was before the big April offensive you're talking about, but there was the 92nd hadn't been in the line very long when the German intelligence realized that they were there, and they felt that would be an ideal area to penetrate. So they started an offensive. This was shortly after we got into the line, and within a week at least. And it got serious because it looked like they were going to be able to penetrate through and make a sweep around and come in behind us. So it would have involved a lot more than the 92nd Division. Then the 92nd kind of went into a full retreat, and the 10th Indian Division, which was a crack outfit that had been borrowed from the British 8th Army, but it had been assigned to the American 5th. And they came over, they'd been sent down to a rest area, and they were called back and came roaring back and replaced the 92nd and checked the advance. They were marvelous fighters. Then as these patrols resumed, here would come these patrols of either Sikhs or Gurkhas, and they were so secretive, and they'd travel through the bush, and our patrol would be maybe get there first, and all of a sudden these guys would pop up out of the brush. They were just marvelous in their scouting ability. But going on to more actual first combat experience, the first of my unit was night patrols to the north on skis. It's the only time that we used skis, to at least in the elements I was associated with. The only time in our whole combat experience was in those short 2 or 3 weeks when we were in that Task Force 45. And we'd send out patrols about every other night to look at some of there were several minor ski resorts a bit to the north, and our patrols would go up as far as those. Supposedly they weren't manned, but they were being used as outposts or observation points. So our units did have some skirmishes. We did not lose a man, and we captured, I think it was something like 30 prisoners that were brought in, that we were very happy to deliver back to higher headquarters. And that was the first, for me it was indirect, because I never went out on one of the patrols, but they were from my company.
How about if we move on to talk about the battle for Belvedere /
Yeah.
Gorgolesco?
Yeah, I have to preface this by saying my combat experience was brief compared to most, because I had my demise fairly early on, but and that put an end to my Army career, as it were. But Mount Riva Ridge, of course, is well known to a lot of readers these days. It was very dramatic, but once we gained Riva Ridge and occupied that high point and the Germans no longer had it, then it was feasible to think of taking Mount Belvedere and finally Mount della Torraccia, which was to be the division's final objective for that phase of the campaign. And Belvedere was a tough fight, but I think the 87th was largely responsible for taking Belvedere.
Well, how about if you talk about your own
Yeah.
particular experiences?
All right. Well, my first heavy experience under fire was during the siege of Belvedere. We'd had odd artillery blasting around us, but we were all entrenched in foxholes, our whole battalion, and all night long. This was after the capture of Mount Belvedere, the night after the 87th had taken it, I believe. And the Germans just pounded the whole area with heavy artillery all night long, and shells were landing all around us, and it was a real conditioning effort. We had a few strikes. I think we lost 2 men out of my company, and probably had 4 or 5 wounded from shells that landed in or very close to a foxhole. But it was quite a long night, and one that none of us that were there will ever forget. And the main thing that I can stress about that was, again, like the practice fire